September 20th, 1854. On the heights above the Alma River in Crimea, 25,000 Russian soldiers wait in prepared positions, their artillery pieces aimed at the valley below. Advancing toward them through the morning mist, 60,000 men from 3 continents, British redcoats, French zouaves in flowing North African uniforms, and Ottoman infantry, march into what will become the first major European land battle in nearly 40 years. Before this day ends, the hills will be carpeted with nearly 9,000 dead and wounded, and the age of modern industrial warfare will announce itself with unprecedented fury. But the story of how these armies came to meet on this blood-soaked ground begins not with generals and battle plans, but with monks arguing over keys to a church door in Bethlehem. By the middle of the 19th century, the European order crafted at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 faced mounting pressures that would ultimately shatter it. At the heart of this instability lay the Ottoman Empire, whose domains still stretched from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the Caucasus Mountains. Yet this vast realm, which had once threatened Vienna itself and ruled the Mediterranean, had fallen into precipitous decline. European diplomats whispered about the sick man of Europe, a phrase that captured both the empire's weakness and the dangerous question of what would happen when it finally collapsed. The so-called Eastern question dominated diplomatic calculations across Europe. If the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, who would control the Turkish Straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean? Which power would inherit the Balkans? Who would protect the millions of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule? Each great power had different answers and different ambitions. Russia, under Tsar Nicholas I, harbored dreams that stretched back centuries. Some Russian strategists envisioned an Orthodox Christian empire centered on Constantinople, the ancient Byzantium that had fallen to the Ottomans in 1453. Others looked toward expansion in Central Asia. Russian armies had repeatedly defeated the Ottomans in a series of wars throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, gradually pushing the border southward toward the Black Sea and into the Caucasus. Each victory strengthened Russian confidence that the complete dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire was both inevitable and imminent. The Ottomans themselves desperately sought to preserve their multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. Sultan Abdulmajid I and his advisors recognized that survival required modernization and, crucially, alliances with other European powers. They would need to play Britain and France against Russia, accepting Western interference and concessions as the price of continued existence. It was a humiliating but necessary strategy for an empire that could no longer defend itself alone. Britain and France had their own reasons to prevent Russian expansion. Britain, the dominant global naval and commercial power, could not tolerate Russian control of the Turkish Straits, which would threaten British routes to India and undermine the Royal Navy's supremacy in the Mediterranean. France, under the newly proclaimed Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the great Bonaparte, sought to restore French prestige and influence in European affairs after decades in the diplomatic wilderness. Austria, controlling much of Central Europe and Italy, feared that a stronger Russia in the Balkans would encourage Slavic nationalism within the Habsburg domains, potentially tearing apart Austria's own multi-ethnic empire. These were the great powers circling the weakening Ottoman giant in the early 1850s. What would trigger their collision was something seemingly trivial: a dispute over which Christian monks should hold the keys to certain holy sites in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. In the spring of 1852, tensions escalated over access to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, sites sacred to all Christian denominations. The Ottoman authorities had to decide whether Roman Catholic clergymen, backed by France, or Orthodox clergy, supported by Russia, would receive privileged access to these shrines. For decades, these arrangements had shifted back and forth depending on which European power held more influence in Constantinople. Napoleon III, consolidating his rule after his December 1851 coup d'état, needed a diplomatic victory to cement his legitimacy. He demanded that the Ottoman Sultan grant the Catholics primacy at the holy sites. To back up this demand, in early 1853 he dispatched the warship Charlemagne toward the Ottoman capital. Faced with the implied threat of French naval power, Sultan Abdulmajid I relented and granted the Catholics their demands. This infuriated Tsar Nicholas I, a deeply pious ruler who saw himself as the divinely appointed protector of Orthodox Christians everywhere. To the Tsar, the holy sites question was not merely a diplomatic game, but a sacred duty. Russia's claims to protect Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman Empire rested on earlier treaty provisions, particularly from the 1774 Kochek-Konarja Treaty, which Russia interpreted or misinterpreted as granting them such rights. In February 1853, Prince Alexander Sergeyevich Menshikov arrived in Constantinople as Tsar Nicholas I's special envoy. A descendant of one of Peter the Great's favorites, Menshikov carried demands that went far beyond reversing the Sultan's recent decision about the holy sites. Russia wanted formal recognition as the protector of all 12 million Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule, a demand that would effectively grant Russia the right to interfere in Ottoman internal affairs whenever it chose. The British and French ambassadors in Constantinople immediately recognized the strategic danger. If Russia gained such rights, the Ottoman Empire would become a Russian protectorate in all but name. They encouraged the Sultan to stand firm. Ottoman officials themselves were divided. A peace party, led by some senior ministers, advocated compromise to avoid war. A war party, including many younger military officers who had been pushing for army reforms, argued that conceding to Russia would mean the end of Ottoman independence. Better to fight with European allies than submit to slow strangulation.
On May 5, 1853, after weeks of fruitless negotiations, Menshikov delivered an ultimatum: accept Russian demands or face the consequences. When the Sultan refused, Menshikov broke off diplomatic relations and departed Constantinople. In France, newspapers whipped up anti-Russian sentiment. One provincial journal, L'Union Franc-Comtoise, published a warning that captured the religious fervor some saw in the conflict. If Russia conquered Ottoman territory, Orthodox Christianity would be imposed by Cossack arms, and Catholicism would perish in the frozen deserts of Siberia. Throughout the summer of 1853, the crisis deepened. The Ottoman government mobilized its army, a decision that some historians argue may have made war more likely by creating a use-it-or-lose-it situation. The Ottomans could not afford to keep their forces mobilized indefinitely. Britain and France issued pledges of support, though the exact terms remained unclear. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas I believed that Britain would ultimately remain neutral and that France lacked the will for sustained war. In July 1853, Russian forces crossed into the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, territories that, though under Ottoman suzerainty, had been effectively autonomous. Russian occupation of these principalities was presented as a temporary measure to pressure the Ottomans into accepting Russian demands. But it was an act of war, and both sides knew it. The descent into war. Through the late summer and early autumn of 1853, diplomatic efforts continued even as armies maneuvered. The Ottoman government, facing financial strain from maintaining mobilization and emboldened by Anglo-French support, finally lost patience. On October 4, 1853, Sultan Abdul-Majid I formally declared war on Russia. What would later become known as the Crimean War had begun, though at this stage it was simply another Russo-Turkish conflict, the latest in a long series stretching back generations. Both sides cloaked their geopolitical ambitions in religious rhetoric. Tsar Nicholas I proclaimed that he waged war neither for worldly advantages nor for conquests, but for a solely Christian purpose. Some contemporary observers and later historians would call this conflict the Last Crusade, reflecting the genuine religious passions it aroused alongside the strategic calculations. Yet behind the pious declarations lay concrete territorial goals. Russia aimed to dismember the Ottoman Empire, annexing strategic territories and creating Russian client states throughout the Balkans. The ultimate prize remained Constantinople and control of the Turkish Straits, which would transform Russia from a Black Sea power into a Mediterranean one. The Ottomans fought for survival, hoping not merely to preserve their empire, but also, with Anglo-French assistance, to create independent buffer states in Georgia, Crimea, and Circassia that would check future Russian expansion. The Russian army that mobilized for war in 1853 numbered approximately 900,000 regulars, with another 500,000 reservists, the largest standing army in the world. However, the vast distances of the Russian Empire and the need to garrison borders from Poland to Siberia meant that only a fraction of this force could be concentrated on any single front. Russian military technology lagged behind Western Europe. Rifles were less advanced, industrial capacity more limited, yet Russian soldiers earned a fearsome reputation for stoicism and endurance. The Ottoman military establishment theoretically fielded over 200,000 men, but corruption, poor organization, and inadequate funding left actual combat strength uncertain. Ottoman artillery, purchased from Western manufacturers, was modern and effective. Ottoman infantry, when well led, could fight with tremendous courage. But the empire spent a mere 18 silver rubles per soldier annually, compared to 32 by Russia, 85 by France, and 134 by Britain. This disparity in military investment would manifest itself in equipment, training, and logistics throughout the war. At sea, Russia possessed clear superiority in the Black Sea theater. The Russian Black Sea Fleet included modern steam-powered warships and sailed from well-fortified bases at Sevastopol in Crimea. The Ottoman fleet, while possessing some capable vessels, could not match Russian strength. This imbalance would lead to the war's first dramatic encounter. On the morning of November 30th, 1853, the Ottoman frigate squadron lay at anchor in the harbor of Sinope on the southern coast of the Black Sea. The small Ottoman flotilla had sought shelter there while transporting troops and supplies along the Anatolian coast. Ottoman naval commander Osman Pasha knew Russian warships were at sea but hoped the harbor's coastal fortifications would provide adequate protection. Shortly after noon, 6 Russian ships of the line under Vice Admiral Pavel Stepanovich Nakhimov appeared off the harbor entrance. The Russian ships mounted more than 700 guns against the Ottomans' 400, but the disparity in firepower was even greater than these numbers suggested. The Russians carried newly developed explosive shells, Paixhan guns, that fired hollow projectiles packed with gunpowder, designed to explode on impact or via timed fuses. These weapons had never been used in combat before. The Battle of Sinope lasted approximately 4 hours and resulted in one of the most one-sided naval victories in history. Russian explosive shells tore through wooden Ottoman hulls with devastating effect, setting ships ablaze and causing catastrophic explosions when flames reached powder magazines. Of the Ottoman squadron's 7 frigates and 5 smaller vessels, only 1 steamer managed to escape. More than 3,000 Ottoman sailors died in the harbor or drowned in the frigid waters. Russian casualties numbered fewer than 40 killed and 100 wounded. The tactical significance was immediate. Russia now controlled the Black Sea, isolating Ottoman positions in the Caucasus and threatening the Ottomans' northern coast. But the strategic impact proved even more profound. News of the battle reached Western Europe within days via the new telegraph networks, where it was sensationalized as the massacre at Sinope. British and French newspapers published graphic accounts of Ottoman sailors burning to death on their ships, of Russian vessels firing into lifeboats and swimmers. Whether these allegations were true remained disputed, but the public outcry was genuine. The Battle of Sinope pushed Britain and France decisively towards intervention. Public opinion in both countries, already sympathetic to the Ottoman cause and suspicious of Russian ambitions, now demanded action. Military preparations that had been tentative became urgent.
While Sinope grabbed headlines, the principal land campaign of late 1853 and early 1854 unfolded along the Danube River. Russian commanders hoped that Orthodox Christian populations in the Balkans would rise against Muslim Ottoman rule, welcoming Russian forces as liberators. This calculation proved mistaken. Most Balkan Christians, while perhaps preferring Christian to Muslim overlords in the abstract, had no desire to exchange Ottoman rule for Russian domination. Memories of Russian repression in Poland were fresh, and many Bulgarians, Serbs, and Romanians hoped instead for independence from all empires. Ottoman forces had prepared defensive positions along the southern bank of the Danube, taking advantage of the river's width and the fortifications at key crossing points. Initial Russian probing attacks in late 1853 achieved little. The winter of 1853-1854 passed relatively quietly as both sides reinforced their positions and waited for the spring campaigning season. In March 1854, with the ground firm and supplies accumulated, Russian forces under Field Marshal Ivan Paskovich launched a major offensive. Approximately 45,000 Russian troops crossed the Danube at multiple points, aiming to capture the fortress cities of Vidin and Silistra. Vidin controlled the route into Serbia, where Russian sympathies ran stronger than elsewhere in the Balkans. Silistra guarded the road to the Ottoman capital itself. The siege of Silistra, beginning in late April 1854, became the centerpiece of this campaign. The fortress garrison of 12,000 Ottoman troops, reinforced by several hundred British and French volunteer officers and engineers, prepared for a prolonged defense. Russian siege artillery pounded the walls day and night, while mining operations sought to tunnel under the fortifications and blow gaps for assault columns. British Captain James Butler, serving as a volunteer advisor to the Ottoman garrison, recorded his admiration for Ottoman courage under fire. He described watching Ottoman soldiers continue their work even as artillery killed men around them, calmly taking up the shovels of the fallen and continuing without apparent fear. Such stoicism was matched by brutal casualties. Silistra's hospitals overflowed with wounded men, many dying from infected wounds in an era before antiseptic surgery. By early June 1854, Russian forces were preparing for a final massive assault on Silistra's battered walls. Mining operations had successfully placed explosive charges under key defensive positions. Assault columns stood ready, knowing that street-by-street fighting through a fortified city would cost thousands of lives, but that victory seemed within reach. Then, just 2 hours before the attack was scheduled to begin, orders arrived from St. Petersburg: abandon the siege and withdraw from the Danubian principalities. The character of the war had changed fundamentally. Throughout the winter and spring of 1853-1854, while Ottoman and Russian armies clashed along the Danube and in the Caucasus, diplomatic negotiations continued in Vienna. Austria, though not a belligerent, hosted discussions aimed at finding a peaceful resolution. Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph faced a delicate situation. He needed to prevent Russian domination of the Balkans, which would threaten Austrian interests, but he also wanted to avoid war if possible. Austria owed Russia a debt of gratitude. Russian armies had helped crush the Hungarian Revolution of 1848-1849, but gratitude meant little weighed against vital strategic interests. When negotiations failed to produce Ottoman-Russian agreement, Britain and France issued an ultimatum in March 1854. Russia must evacuate the Danubian principalities or face war. The Tsar, convinced that this was bluff and that the Western powers lacked the will for sustained conflict, refused. On March 27 and 28, 1854, Britain and France formally declared war on Russia. The Eastern War had become a great power conflict. British war aims centered on blocking Russian expansion, preventing Russian control of Constantinople and the Straits, and protecting British commercial interests throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and routes to India.
Some British politicians proposed ambitious schemes to permanently weaken Russia, detaching Finland and returning it to Swedish control, creating an independent Poland, perhaps even ceding the Baltic provinces to Prussia in exchange for Prussian neutrality or support. Lord Palmerston, Britain's most influential statesman and soon-to-be Prime Minister, advocated a comprehensive rollback of Russian power. France entered the war with different motivations. Emperor Napoleon III sought international prestige and recognition for his new regime. French commercial interests in the Levant needed protection. Napoleon III also harbored genuine ideological opposition to Tsarist autocracy and sympathy for nationalist movements, though he would support such movements only when convenient to French interests. The war offered France a chance to play a leading role in European affairs for the first time since the Napoleonic Wars. The combined Allied forces now arrayed against Russia constituted the most formidable military coalition assembled since 1815. France fielded approximately 439,000 troops, with the French army widely recognized as Europe's finest. French soldiers had extensive recent combat experience from colonial campaigns in Algeria, where they had developed new tactics and tested equipment in harsh conditions. French logistics, engineering, and staff work excelled, lessons learned from Napoleon Bonaparte's campaigns having been thoroughly studied and applied. British Army numbered only 153,000 men, most scattered throughout the empire's far-flung garrisons. Only 21,500 were immediately available for service against Russia. The British Army suffered from lack of recent combat experience. The last major European war had ended in 1815, and from organizational sclerosis. Command positions went to aristocrats who purchased their commissions rather than earning them through merit. Supply and medical services were antiquated. However, British infantry carried the new Minié rifle, a muzzle-loading weapon with rifled barrel that dramatically outranged smoothbore muskets. British soldiers were professional, long-service volunteers, well-drilled if sometimes poorly led. At sea, Allied superiority was overwhelming. The combined British and French navies deployed approximately 400 warships of all types against fewer than 100 Russian vessels. The Allied fleets included both traditional sailing ships of the line and modern steam-powered screw warships that could maneuver independent of wind. The Royal Navy alone possessed 60 ships of the line, giving it the capability to project power anywhere in the world. The Allied declaration of war infuriated many Russians, who saw Western hypocrisy in the intervention. Nationalist writer Mikhail Pogodin articulated a view common among educated Russians. France seized Algeria from Ottoman control, and Britain annexed Indian principalities almost annually. Yet when Russia temporarily occupied 2 Ottoman provinces, this supposedly disturbed the balance of power. Russian intellectuals complained of blind hatred from the West, which refused to understand Russian civilization and Russian rights. Allied forces began concentrating at the Black Sea port of Varna in Ottoman Bulgaria through the spring and summer of 1854. More than 100,000 French, British, and Ottoman troops assembled in massive camps around the city. Their presence and the threat they posed to Russian forces occupying the Danubian principalities contributed to the Russian decision to abandon the siege of Silistra and withdraw. Austria now played a crucial diplomatic card. The Austrian government demanded Russian evacuation of Moldavia and Wallachia, mobilizing 280,000 troops to back up this demand. If Austria joined the war on the Allied side, Russian armies in the Balkans would face encirclement and destruction. Faced with this threat, Tsar Nicholas ordered withdrawal. Austrian forces then peacefully occupied the principalities with Ottoman permission, creating a buffer that would prevent further Russo-Ottoman clashes on the Danube. The Russian retreat from the Danube represented a significant Ottoman strategic victory, achieved with minimal Ottoman casualties. The threat to Constantinople had been removed. The war's focus would now shift dramatically.
The Allied armies concentrated at Varna through the summer of 1854 faced an enemy more deadly than Russian soldiers: disease. Cholera, typhus, and dysentery swept through the crowded encampments. Inadequate sanitation, contaminated water supplies, and limited medical knowledge created perfect conditions for epidemic. Men died by the hundreds, then thousands. French losses to disease exceeded 5,000 by August. British regiments lost a third of their strength to sickness before firing a shot in anger. The conditions at Varna shocked soldiers and officers alike. Tents offered inadequate shelter from the summer heat. Supplies arrived irregularly. Local food and water could not be trusted. The dead were buried in mass graves. Hospitals overflowed with men suffering from dysentery and cholera, conditions that 19th-century medicine could do little to treat. Both the supreme Allied commanders, British Lord Raglan and French Marshal Jacques Leroy de Saint-Arnaud, would themselves succumb to disease before the year ended. With the Russian threat to the Danube eliminated, the question became, what next? Some voices argued for returning home, mission accomplished. Others proposed opening new fronts in the Baltic or Caucasus. But the political imperative remained strong. Britain and France had committed to war at enormous expense and with great public fanfare. They needed a decisive victory, something that would justify the cost and secure advantageous peace terms. The target chosen was Sevastopol, Russia's great naval base on the Crimean Peninsula. Capturing Sevastopol would eliminate Russian naval power in the Black Sea, protect Ottoman territory permanently, and inflict a humiliating defeat on the Tsar. The decision was strategic, but also symbolic. Sevastopol represented Russian prestige and power in the south. Planning for the Crimean expedition revealed significant problems. The Allies possessed no accurate maps of the Crimean Peninsula. Intelligence about Russian defenses came from outdated sources. Logistical challenges were immense. The expedition would require landing 60,000 troops on a hostile shore with all their equipment, supplies, horses, and artillery, then sustaining them hundreds of miles from the nearest major base. Nevertheless, confidence ran high. Allied commanders expected that Sevastopol would fall within weeks, allowing the army to return home before winter. On September 14, 1854, an armada of nearly 400 ships carrying 60,000 Allied troops appeared off the small Crimean town of Evpatoria on the western coast of the peninsula. The fleet represented one of the largest amphibious operations ever attempted. For 2 days, soldiers, horses, artillery, and supplies were ferried ashore in small boats. The landings were unopposed. Russian forces, surprised by an operation so late in the campaign season and uncertain where the blow would fall, had not concentrated their limited Crimean garrison. Many of the soldiers who came ashore were already sick with cholera, their constitutions weakened by months in the disease-ridden camps at Varna. The expedition began in chaos. The Allies had insufficient transport wagons, forcing soldiers to confiscate carts and animals from local Crimean Tatar civilians. Relations with the local population, already poor, worsened immediately. The Allied army that began marching south towards Sevastopol on September 19 numbered approximately 60,000, 30,000 French, 26,000 British, and 4,000 Ottomans, plus attached Sardinian observers. Against them, Russian forces in Crimea totaled perhaps 25,000, outnumbered but fighting on their own territory with the advantage of prepared defensive positions. On September 20, 1854, Russian commander Prince Alexander Sergeyevich Menshikov, the same man who had delivered Russia's ultimatum to Constantinople 18 months earlier, positioned his army on the heights above the Alma River to block the Allied advance on Sevastopol. The position was formidable. The southern bank of the river rose sharply to form ridges and plateaus 300 to 400 feet above the valley floor. Russian artillery placed on these heights commanded all approaches. Infantry occupied stone walls and hastily constructed earthworks. The river itself, while not deep, presented an obstacle to advancing troops weighed down with equipment.
Menshikov deployed approximately 33,000 infantry and 96 guns, confident that the natural strength of his position would allow his outnumbered force to defeat the Allied attack. Russian soldiers, many veterans of campaigns in the Caucasus, prepared their positions with professional skill. Officers distributed extra ammunition and checked firing positions. Artillery crews ranged their guns on likely approach routes. The battle plan called for a coordinated assault across a broad front. The French divisions under Marshal Saint-Arnaud would attack on the right, near the coast where naval gunfire could support them. British divisions under Lord Raglan would assault the center and left of the Russian line. Ottoman troops would serve primarily in reserve. It was a straightforward plan, perhaps too straightforward, relying on numerical superiority and Allied elan to overwhelm Russian defenders. The battle began around mid-morning with French skirmishers advancing through vineyards and gardens toward the river. Russian artillery immediately opened fire, round shot and shell plunging into the French formations. The distinctive Zouaves, French colonial infantry recruited from Algeria, wearing baggy red trousers and short blue jackets, and the marine infantry pushed forward steadily, despite casualties. They reached the Alma, waded through water waist-deep in places, and began scrambling up the far bank toward Russian positions. Lieutenant Collet, serving with a French battalion, watched his comrades advance into a storm of artillery fire. Russian projectiles passed overhead with their characteristic screaming sound, churning up earth and throwing deadly fragments when they struck rock or hard ground. Men fell, but the advance continued. The Zouaves, veterans of brutal fighting in Algeria, maintained their cohesion even under heavy fire. However, part of the French assault became disorganized in difficult terrain and the attack stalled. French commanders urgently requested British support. Lord Raglan, observing from a better vantage point than the French commanders, could see that his divisions were not yet needed on the French sector, but he gave the order anyway, partly from Allied solidarity, partly from fear that French failure would doom the entire assault. British regiments advanced in their famous linear formations, scarlet coats and white cross belts making them conspicuous targets. They crossed the Alma under heavy artillery fire, then began climbing the slopes directly into prepared Russian defensive positions. The assault was frontal, direct, and bloody. Ensign Hugh Annesley of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers found himself in the midst of intense close-range combat. British troops pushed to within 30 or 40 yards of Russian breastworks before Russian volleys tore through their ranks. Annesley took a musket ball full in the mouth, a wound that should have killed him. As British formations wavered under the punishment, officers ordered a withdrawal to reform. Annesley, bleeding heavily, ran back down the slope toward the river. Russian infantry, sensing British weakness, counterattacked down the slopes. For a crucial few minutes, the battle hung in the balance. If Russian counterattacks could drive the British back across the Alma, the entire Allied offensive might collapse. But British rifle fire stopped the Russian advance. The Minié rifle, accurate to 300 yards, compared to perhaps 100 for smoothbore muskets, allowed British infantry to pour devastating volleys into Russian columns at ranges where the Russians could not effectively reply. Russian officer Edward Ivanovich Todolebin, who would later gain fame as Sevastopol's chief engineer, witnessed the futility of advancing against modern rifles. Russian battalions charged bravely, but British soldiers simply stepped back, maintained distance, and fired methodically. Russian columns suffered terrible casualties without ever closing to bayonet range. The attack broke, and Russian infantry fell back to their original positions. Meanwhile, on the Allied right flank, French and Ottoman troops successfully stormed the heights. The combination of accurate French rifle fire, aggressive use of light infantry tactics learned in Algeria, and the shock of Zouave close assaults proved too much for Russian defenders. As French troops reached the crests and began to enfilade Russian positions, Menshikov realized his entire line faced collapse. He ordered withdrawal. The Alma lasted approximately 3 hours. Allied casualties totaled roughly 3,600 killed and wounded, approximately 1,500 French, 2,000 British, and smaller Ottoman losses. Russian casualties approached 5,000. These were unprecedented losses for such a brief engagement, a harbinger of what industry-age firepower would do to massed infantry. The aftermath of the Alma was proved as terrible as the battle itself. Both armies lacked adequate medical services. Wounded men lay on the battlefield throughout the night, crying for water and assistance that did not come. Russian medical orderlies described heart-wrenching scenes, hundreds of wounded abandoned by their regiments, men with catastrophic injuries begging to be lifted into carts, soldiers with limbs blown off and jaws shattered, unable even to ask for water, their suffering expressed only through their eyes. The Allies won a clear tactical victory, opening the road to Sevastopol. Russian forces withdrew in disorder. For 2 crucial days, Sevastopol lay essentially undefended. A rapid Allied advance could have seized the city with minimal resistance, but the Allied commanders, shaken by their own casualties and uncertain of Russian strength, hesitated. This hesitation would prove costly. The Allied armies did not march directly on Sevastopol after the Alma. Instead, commanders spent 2 days reorganizing, treating wounded, and debating their next move. When they finally advanced, they chose to march around Sevastopol to attack from the south, believing, incorrectly, that the southern defenses were weaker than the northern approaches. This flank march took several days and allowed Russian defenders critical time to strengthen Sevastopol's fortifications. The Allies also captured the small port of Balaclava, making it their primary supply base. Balaclava's harbor was tiny, barely adequate for the massive Allied logistical requirements, but it was the only decent anchorage on the southern Crimean coast. British forces would be responsible for defending the supply lines from Balaclava to the siege lines around Sevastopol. By the end of September 1854, Allied forces had invested Sevastopol from the south and begun constructing their own siege works. Trenches snaked forward toward Russian positions. Redoubts, earthwork fortifications, were built to protect artillery batteries. The siege settled into a routine of constant construction, periodic bombardments, and small-scale raids and counter-raids. British Captain Radcliffe described the dangerous tedium of trench duty. A few soldiers posted as lookouts, watching for the flash of Russian guns, calling out warnings so men could duck below the earthen breastworks before shells arrived. Between bombardments, soldiers worked to deepen trenches, strengthen parapets, and move supplies forward. Death came randomly. A shell bursting overhead, a sniper's bullet, a cannonball striking a crowded section of trench. Russian commanders, meanwhile, planned a breakout. Their objective was to sever Allied supply lines by capturing Balaclava, destroying the harbor facilities, and forcing the Allies to abandon the siege. The plan called for Russian forces to attack at dawn on October 25, 1854, overwhelming the thinly defended positions between Sevastopol and Balaclava. The Battle of Balaclava began before dawn on October 25, when Russian forces totaling approximately 25,000 men advanced from Sevastopol toward the Allied supply base. The first Allied positions they encountered were a series of small redoubts on low hills manned primarily by Ottoman infantry. These redoubts, hastily constructed and inadequately supplied, mounted captured Russian artillery pieces. The leading redoubt, manned by about 500 Ottoman soldiers, resisted fiercely despite being outnumbered 10-1. Ottoman infantry poured rifle and cannon fire into advancing Russian columns, inflicting significant casualties, but sheer numbers told. Russian infantry stormed the position, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand fighting before overwhelming the defenders. Some Ottoman soldiers fought to the death. Others attempted to flee, but were cut down by Russian cavalry. News of the first redoubt's fall sparked panic in the other Ottoman positions. Commanders, fearing encirclement, ordered withdrawal. Within an hour, Russian forces had captured a chain of redoubts and were advancing on Balaclava itself. Only one Allied unit stood between the Russians and the harbor, the 93rd Highlanders, a Scottish infantry regiment of about 500 men commanded by Sir Colin Campbell. Campbell formed his men in line, not the traditional British square formation used to repel cavalry, but a simple two-deep line that maximized firepower. Russian cavalry, perhaps 1,500 horsemen, charged the position. At 200 yards, Campbell ordered volley fire. The Highlanders fired as if on parade, steady, disciplined, devastating. Horses and men crumpled. The cavalry charge wavered, then broke. Russian horsemen retreated without ever reaching British lines. War correspondent William Howard Russell witnessed this stand and wrote some of the most famous lines in military journalism. The Russians dash on towards that thin red streak topped with a line of steel. His phrase, "the thin red streak," was misquoted and immortalized as the thin red line, forever associated with British military courage. With the initial Russian advance stopped, British cavalry and additional infantry reinforcements arrived on the battlefield. Russian forces withdrew slightly, consolidating around the captured redoubts and preparing to hold their gains. Lord Raglan, the British commander observing from heights above the battlefield, was humiliated that Russian forces now possessed British artillery pieces captured from the redoubts. He issued orders to recapture these guns. However, Raglan's orders were vague, written hastily and delivered to messengers who could not see what Raglan could see from his high vantage point. The commander of the Light Cavalry Brigade, Lord Cardigan, understood his orders to mean he should charge straight down a valley directly toward Russian artillery positions. A suicidal order, but an order nonetheless. At approximately 11 a.m. on October 25th, the Light Brigade, about 670 cavalry in 5 regiments, began their charge down what became known as the Valley of Death. Russian artillery on 3 sides poured fire into advancing horsemen. Captain Louis Nolan, who had delivered Raglan's order and realized too late the terrible mistake, rode frantically trying to redirect the charge, but was killed by artillery fire within minutes. The Light Brigade reached Russian positions, engaged in a brief but fierce combat, then retreated back through the gauntlet of artillery fire. Of 670 men who began the charge, approximately 113 were killed and 134 wounded. Nearly 500 horses were killed or had to be destroyed. The charge accomplished nothing tactically, but became one of the most famous military actions in history, immortalized by Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, as an example of courage in the face of military incompetence. The Battle of Balaclava ended as a limited Russian tactical victory. They had captured several positions and taken British artillery pieces, though they failed to reach Balaclava harbor itself. More importantly, they had demonstrated that Sevastopol's garrison remained capable of offensive operations, complicating Allied siege plans. Encouraged by the partial success at Balaclava, Tsar Nicholas I ordered his Russian forces to launch another major attack, this time aimed at Inkerman Ridge. If Russian forces could seize Inkerman, their artillery would command the rear of Allied siege lines, potentially forcing the Allies to abandon their positions. The plan called for 50,000 Russian troops to attack at approximately 16,000 Allied soldiers, primarily British, in the pre-dawn darkness of November 5, 1854. Dense fog, while concealing Russian approach, also disrupted command and control. The Battle of Inkerman devolved into what became known as the Soldiers' Battle, a chaotic series of small unit actions fought at close range in limited visibility, where junior officers and individual soldiers made tactical decisions in the absence of higher direction. Russian columns advanced through the fog, capturing some Allied redoubts in initial assaults. British troops, fighting in scattered groups, launched immediate counterattacks to retake lost positions. Fighting surged back and forth over the same ground. Visibility was so poor that soldiers sometimes stumbled into enemy forces at ranges of 10 to 20 yards. Rifle fire at these ranges was devastating. Artillery crews fired at mouth flashes in the fog, uncertain whether they targeted friend or foe. Russian confusion prevented planned diversionary attacks against French positions. This allowed French commanders to dispatch reinforcements to aid hard-pressed British units. General Pierre-François Joseph Bosquet led Zouave regiments forward at a critical moment. French soldier Louis Noir decorded the dramatic scene. Bosquet drew his sword, placed himself at the head of his Zouaves, and pointed towards the Russian masses and shouted in a voice like thunder, "Forward, at the bayonet!" The French counterattack broke Russian momentum. Zouaves firing and advancing in their distinctive style poured devastating volleys into wavering Russian formations. Russian officers could not locate reserves to commit to the fight. Units had become scattered in the fog and broken terrain. By early afternoon, Russian forces began withdrawing in disorder. The Battle of Inkerman cost the Allies approximately 4,300 casualties, losses they could ill afford. Russian casualties exceeded 12,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The defeat crushed Russian hopes of relieving Sevastopol in 1854 and demonstrated that Allied forces, despite their own problems, retained clear tactical superiority. The siege would continue through the approaching winter.
Faced increasing privation as the Allied blockade restricted supplies. Disease continued to rage. Food became scarce. Yet the Russian defenders worked constantly to strengthen fortifications, knowing that spring would bring renewed Allied assaults. For Allied forces besieging the city, conditions were equally grim. British troops suffered especially severely. Army logistical planning had been inadequate for a summer campaign. It proved catastrophically insufficient for winter. Soldiers lacked proper cold weather clothing, adequate shelter, and sufficient food. The route from Balaclava to the siege lines became a muddy morass, impassable for wagons. Supplies piled up at the harbor while troops at the front went hungry and cold. Disease killed more men than Russian bullets. Cholera, dysentery, typhus, and typhoid ravaged the army. British casualties from disease during the winter exceeded 20,000, nearly the entire original British expeditionary force. Both Lord Raglan and Marshal Saint-Arnaud died from disease, replaced by commanders who inherited a deteriorating situation. Ottoman troops serving with the Allies suffered from neglect. Ottoman commanders, dependent on British and French supply systems, found their men short of food and medicine. British Admiral Adolphus Slade, serving with Ottoman forces, criticized Ottoman officers for their unwillingness to demand better treatment from their allies, noting that for these commanders, the loss of 1,000 men was not to be named in the same breath with the loss of the English general's smile. French forces, better prepared and organized than their British allies, suffered less but still endured terrible conditions. The French army's experience in Algeria had taught valuable lessons about logistics, sanitation, and medical care. French soldiers received warmer clothing, more regular food supplies, and somewhat better medical attention than British troops. News of the army's suffering reached Britain through an unprecedented media campaign. The Telegraph allowed war correspondents to transmit reports from Crimea to London in days, sometimes hours. Photographers captured images of officers and camps, staged and sanitized but powerful nonetheless. William Howard Russell's dispatches to the Times described in vivid detail the incompetence and suffering, sparking public outrage. British poet Edmund Gosse recalled the war's impact on civilian life. The declaration of war brought the first breath of outside life into our Calvinist cloister. My parents took in a daily newspaper which they had never done before, and events in picturesque places were eagerly discussed. The Crimean War became the first war that ordinary citizens could follow in near real time, and public opinion influenced government policy as never before. The scandal of army conditions helped force Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen to resign in January 1855. His replacement, Lord Palmerston, promised more aggressive prosecution of the war and immediate reforms to supply and medical services. Florence Nightingale gained fame for her work organizing nursing care at British hospitals in Scutari, near Constantinople. Her efforts to professionalize nursing and improve hospital administration saved lives, though modern historians debate the extent of her impact on overall mortality rates. Russian forces faced similar medical challenges.
Surgeon Nikolai Ivanovich Pirogov pioneered the system of medical triage, categorizing wounded by severity of injury and treating the most critical cases first. This system, revolutionary in the 1850s, would not be adopted by Western armies until World War I. Pirogov also made extensive use of ether anesthesia and pioneered techniques for field amputation. Thanks to his methods, Russian soldiers who underwent amputation had higher survival rates than their Allied counterparts. Yet even Pirogov could not overcome the systemic problems of Russian military medicine. Supply shortages, corruption, inadequate facilities, and sheer numbers of casualties overwhelmed the medical system. Author Leo Tolstoy, serving as an artillery officer in Sevastopol, wrote bitterly of an army degraded by corruption and incompetence. "We have no army. We have a horde of slaves cowed by discipline, ordered about by thieves and slave traders." The civilian population of Crimea suffered perhaps worst of all. Most Crimean residents were Tatars, a Muslim Turkic people whom Russian authorities suspected of Ottoman sympathies. Throughout the war, Tsarist policies grew increasingly repressive. Individual Tatars suspected of aiding the Allies faced deportation to Central Asia. Tatar property was confiscated. Some Tatars fled to Ottoman-controlled territory, while Russian authorities encouraged Christian settlers from the Balkans and Slavic provinces to migrate to Crimea. These wartime policies accelerated a demographic transformation that by war's end would make Crimean Tatars a minority in their ancestral homeland. While Sevastopol dominated attention, fighting occurred across multiple theaters. In the Baltic Sea, the Royal Navy led Allied efforts to pressure Russia's northern ports. British and French fleets totaling more than 100 ships appeared in Baltic waters in spring 1854, hoping to attack Russian naval bases at Reval and Kronstadt, which protected St. Petersburg itself. However, Russian forces avoided battle, withdrawing their fleet to the protection of coastal fortifications. British and French warships bombarded Russian coastal positions with limited effect. Stone fortifications proved difficult to reduce through naval gunfire alone. The most significant Baltic operation occurred in August 1854, when French troops landed on the Russian-controlled Åland Islands and besieged the fortress of Bomersund. The siege of Bomersund lasted approximately 2 weeks. Allied forces deployed modern siege artillery and naval guns against fortifications that, while strong, had been designed decades earlier against less powerful weapons. Russian garrison commander Major General Bodisko, with fewer than 2,900 troops and limited supplies, held out as long as possible before surrendering on August 16, 1854. The Allies offered the Åland Islands to Sweden if Sweden would join the war, but Swedish King Oscar I declined. Allied forces withdrew, and Russian administration resumed after the war. Allied naval forces ranged extraordinarily far from European waters. Ships appeared in the Arctic White Sea, bombarding isolated Russian outposts. In the Pacific, British and French squadrons attacked the Siberian coast of the Sea of Okhotsk and attempted a landing on Kamchatka. These operations had minimal strategic impact, but demonstrated Allied naval reach and diverted Russian resources to defend distant territories. In the Caucasus, a separate campaign unfolded between Russian and Ottoman forces. Fighting in the Caucasus predated the larger war. Russia and Ottoman Empire had been contesting this region for decades. Ottoman forces, reinforced with some British supplies and advisors, achieved limited early successes. However, Russian counterattacks gradually pushed back Ottoman forces. The most significant Caucasus operation occurred in late 1855 with the Russian siege of Kars, an Ottoman fortress city in Armenia. Kars's garrison, commanded by British General William Fenwick Williams, serving as an Ottoman advisor, withstood Russian attacks from June through November 1855. Disease, starvation, and constant bombardment reduced the garrison's fighting strength from approximately 18,000 to fewer than 7,000 effective troops. On November 26, 1855, with no prospect of relief and facing complete starvation, Williams surrendered. Russian control of Kars gave them a significant bargaining chip for eventual peace negotiations.
In January 1855, the Kingdom of Sardinia formally joined the Allied coalition. King Victor Emmanuel II and Prime Minister Count Camillo Benso di Cavour calculated that supporting France and Britain in the Crimea would earn Napoleon III's support for Sardinian ambitions in Italy. The Sardinian contribution was modest, approximately 15,000 troops dispatched to Crimea, but politically significant. Sardinian forces arrived in Crimea in spring 1855 and took up positions alongside French and British units in the siege lines around Sevastopol. Sardinian troops participated in the August 1855 Battle of the Chernaya River, where they helped repulse a major Russian sortie. Sardinian casualties in the Crimean campaign totaled approximately 2,000, most from disease rather than combat. The Sardinian gambit would prove successful. At the Paris Peace Conference following the war, Cavour gained a seat at the table and used the opportunity to raise the Italian question, arguing for French support of Italian unification under Sardinian leadership. This diplomatic groundwork would bear fruit in 1859, when France and Sardinia allied against Austria in the Second Italian War of Independence. Austria's position throughout the Crimean War remained complex. Vienna mobilized large forces and threatened intervention against Russia, compelling Russian withdrawal from the Danubian principalities. Austrian occupation of those territories prevented renewed Russo-Ottoman conflict on the Danube. Yet, Austria never actually declared war on Russia. This policy satisfied Austria's immediate strategic needs, preventing Russian domination of the Balkans, while avoiding the costs of active warfare. However, Austria's ambiguous stance alienated all sides. Russia felt betrayed, believing Austria owed gratitude for Russian help suppressing the Hungarian Revolution in 1848-1849. Britain and France suspected Austria of bad faith, trying to gain advantages without taking risks. When Austria faced its own wars in 1859 and 1866, it would find itself diplomatically isolated, unable to call on allies it had failed to fully support. Prussia, under King Frederick William IV, maintained strict neutrality throughout the Crimean War. Prussian policy aimed to avoid antagonizing either Russia or the Western powers while quietly building military strength. This cautious approach served Prussia well. Within 15 years, Prussia would defeat Austria and France, creating the German Empire through wars that Austria's Crimean-era diplomatic failures helped make possible. By spring 1855, Allied commanders were determined to capture Sevastopol through one massive final effort. The city had withstood siege for nearly a year. Continued operations drained Allied resources and patience. Political pressure from London and Paris demanded results. Allied industrial might manifested itself through spring 1855. A new railway line, constructed from Balaclava to the siege lines, allowed unprecedented quantities of ammunition to be brought forward. This represented the first major military use of railroad technology in warfare. In April 1855 alone, Allied artillery fired more than 160,000 shells into Sevastopol, an expenditure of ammunition unthinkable in earlier wars. The Royal Navy blockaded Russian supply routes through the Sea of Azov, further isolating Sevastopol's garrison. Russian defenders worked desperately to strengthen fortifications, repair damage from bombardments, and conserve dwindling supplies. Yet morale held. Russian soldiers and sailors believed they defended not merely a city, but Russian honor and Orthodox Christianity. Allied forces captured Sevastopol's outer defenses in early June 1855, positioning themselves for final assaults on the city's inner fortifications. Two key positions remained: the Malakov Kurgan, a fortified hill dominating the city's eastern side, and the Great Redan, another fortified position protecting approaches from the south. French commanders proposed a major assault for June 18, 1855, the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, a date with obvious symbolic significance. The plan called for French forces to storm the Malakov first, followed by a British assault on the Redan.
Militarily, the British attack was unnecessary if the French succeeded in taking the Malakov, but Lord Raglan insisted on British participation to preserve national honor. The attack proved a complete failure. Russian defenders had learned of the planned assault. Some historians suggest from Russian spies or from deserters. Others point to loose talk among Allied officers. Whatever the source, Russian forces were fully prepared. When Allied troops emerged from their trenches at dawn on June 18, 1855, Russian artillery and rifle fire cut them down in swaths. French soldier Herbet recorded an ominous encounter the night before the assault. Russian officers crossed no man's land under flag of truce and spoke to French pickets, saying in French, "Come now, gentlemen Frenchmen, when you are ready, we shall be waiting." The Russians' foreknowledge proved devastatingly accurate. The first British assault wave suffered 33% casualties in the first Russian volley. Survivors fled back to their trenches despite officers attempting to rally them. Russian soldier Prokopy Podpalov described the slaughter. Russian bugles sounded, artillery and rifles opened fire, smoke obscured everything, and when it cleared, the ground was covered with British dead. The June 18th assault cost the Allies approximately 7,500 casualties for no gain. The siege stalemate continued through another miserable summer. Allied troops now suffered from what would later be called shell shock or combat fatigue, psychological breakdown from prolonged exposure to combat stress. French soldier Louis Noir observed even veteran Zouaves waking from nightmares, screaming for help against imaginary enemies. Russian casualties approached 250 daily, losses that could not be sustained indefinitely. In July, Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, Sevastopol's commander and hero of the Battle of Sinop, was killed by Allied artillery fire. His death demoralized the garrison, but also strengthened resolve. Russian soldiers swore to hold Sevastopol in Nakhimov's memory. Tsar Alexander II, who had succeeded his father Nicholas I in March 1855, understood that time favored the Allies. With Allied supplies arriving freely through Balaclava, while Russian supply lines through the Sea of Azov were cut, Sevastopol's garrison faced eventual starvation. In August 1855, Russian commanders launched one final major sortie, aiming to disrupt Allied operations and perhaps open supply routes. The Battle of the Chernaya River on August 16, 1855, pitted approximately 30,000 Russian infantry against roughly 27,000 Allied troops, primarily French and Sardinian, with some Turkish units. Russian forces attacked across the Chernaya River, attempting to seize high ground held by Allied defenders. The Russian plan suffered from fundamental flaws. Attacking forces lacked cavalry support and insufficient artillery. Allied forces held defensible terrain. Russian orders were unclear, with different units receiving contradictory instructions. The result was a series of disjointed frontal assaults that achieved nothing. French and Sardinian troops fighting from prepared positions with modern rifles inflicted terrible casualties on advancing Russian columns. Some Russian units broke and fled after suffering 50% losses. By day's end, Russian casualties exceeded 8,000 killed and wounded. Allied casualties totaled fewer than 2,000. The Battle of the Chernaya River achieved nothing for Russia except to further deplete Sevastopol's already inadequate garrison.
Allied commanders prepared one final assault for September 1855. Engineers extended approach trenches to within 50 meters of Russian positions, close enough that Russian sharpshooters could kill individual Allied soldiers, but also close enough for a sudden assault to reach Russian fortifications before defenders could react effectively. Allied casualties during this final approach phase averaged 200 men daily. The assault plan remained unchanged. French forces would storm the Malakoff-Kurgan, followed by British attacks on the Redan. If French forces secured the Malakoff, Russian positions throughout Sevastopol would become untenable. The attack was scheduled for September 8, 1855. At noon, French assault columns suddenly erupted from their trenches and rushed the Malakoff. The attack caught Russian defenders by surprise. They had expected an attack, but not at midday during what should have been a routine day. Russian soldier Prokofy Podpalov described the chaos. "The French were in the Malakhov before our boys had a chance to grab their guns. In a few seconds they had filled the fort with hundreds of their men." French troops poured into the Malakhov, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Russian defenders fought desperately, knowing that loss of the Malakhov meant loss of Sevastopol. Reinforcements rushed to the position, leading to some of the war's most intense close-quarters fighting. But French numbers and the advantage of surprise proved decisive. By mid-afternoon, French forces controlled the Malakhov and were turning captured Russian artillery on other Russian positions. Meanwhile, British forces launched their assault on the Redan. 3 times British infantry charged forward. 3 times they were thrown back with heavy losses. Lieutenant George Griffith described rushing through trenches under heavy fire, climbing a ladder to the top of the Redan's wall, then being unable to advance further due to the press of men, wounded and dead, tumbling down on those trying to climb. Panicked British infantry retreated after suffering 2,600 casualties. British commanders ordered a 4th assault, but French success at the Malakhov made it unnecessary. Russian military engineers had designed Sevastopol's defenses so that fall of the Malakhov rendered other positions indefensible. Russian commanders recognized this and ordered evacuation of the city. The evacuation of Sevastopol began on the night of September 8-9, 1855. Russian troops crossed a floating bridge to the city's northern side, destroying fortifications and military supplies as they withdrew. Nurse Alexandra Stokovich witnessed scenes of chaos and destruction. Explosions everywhere, the city engulfed in flames, Russian troops themselves setting fires to deny the Allies usable facilities, the night sky black with smoke. The siege of Sevastopol had lasted 349 days and cost approximately 102,000 Russian and 71,000 Allied casualties. Allied forces occupied the ruined city on September 9th, finding a landscape of devastation. Destroyed buildings, wrecked fortifications, thousands of unexploded shells, and the detritus of year-long siege warfare. News of Sevastopol's fall reached European capitals within days via telegraph. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander II responded with defiance, comparing the situation to 1812, when Moscow's loss had not prevented eventual Russian victory. "Sevastopol is not Moscow. The Crimea is not Russia. 2 years after the burning of Moscow, our victorious troops were in Paris. We are still the same Russians, and God is with us." Yet the strategic reality was less encouraging for Russia. The fall of Sevastopol eliminated Russian Black Sea naval power. The Baltic remained under Allied naval blockade. In the Caucasus, Russian capture of Kars in November 1855 provided some compensation, giving Russia control of significant Ottoman territory as a bargaining chip for peace negotiations. But overall, Russia's strategic position had deteriorated badly. Allied forces were exhausted. French Emperor Napoleon III, having achieved the prestige victory he sought, wanted peace. British public opinion, shocked by casualties and scandals, increasingly questioned whether preserving Ottoman territory justified continued British losses. In January 1856, Britain assembled a massive Baltic fleet called the Grand Armament, intending to threaten St. Petersburg and Russia's northern ports if the war continued into 1856. Some historians argue that this threat, even though the fleet never saw action, helped convince Russia to accept peace terms. In January 1856, France and Austria jointly presented Russia with an ultimatum: accept the proposed peace terms or face Austrian entry into the conflict and opening a new front. Tsar Alexander, facing the prospect of Austrian armies joining the conflict and opening a new front, agreed to negotiations. Peace talks convened in Paris in February 1856. The negotiations revealed tensions within the Allied coalition. Britain advocated harsh terms, significant Russian territorial concessions, prominent limitations on Russian military power, perhaps even supporting Polish independence or returning Finland to Sweden. France preferred moderate terms that would end the war quickly while preserving some Russian strength as a counterweight to Austrian and British power in the future. French views prevailed.
The Treaty of Paris, signed March 30, 1856, included several key provisions. Russia agreed to cede southern Bessarabia to Moldavia, removing Russian control from the Danube River's mouth. Russia renounced its claimed protectorate over Ottoman Christians and recognized the Danubian Principality's autonomy under collective European guarantee rather than Russian influence. Most significantly, the Black Sea was declared neutral and demilitarized. Neither Russia nor the Ottoman Empire could maintain naval forces or coastal fortifications there. For the Ottoman Empire, the Treaty of Paris represented a significant victory. Ottoman territorial integrity was preserved, with small gains in Bessarabia. The empire's borders were guaranteed by the European great powers. The Ottoman government was received recognition as a European power, with the Sultan's government admitted to the Concert of Europe, the informal system of great power diplomacy that had governed European international relations since 1815. However, the treaty's provisions regarding Ottoman reforms, promises to improve the treatment of Christian minorities and modernize administration, remained largely unimplemented. European powers retained the right to intervene in Ottoman affairs to protect Christian populations, setting precedents for future crises. For Russia, the treaty represented a humiliating but not catastrophic defeat. Territorial losses were modest. The Black Sea neutralization provisions wounded Russian pride, but could be, and eventually were, reversed when international conditions changed. More significant was Russia's diplomatic isolation. The breach with Austria proved lasting, and Russian leaders learned to approach future conflicts with greater caution about European reaction. Allied forces achieved their primary war aim, preventing Russian expansion at Ottoman expense and maintaining British naval dominance in the Mediterranean and Black Sea approaches. However, the war cost 22,000 British lives and revealed serious deficiencies in British military administration. Public disappointment at the costs incurred from modest gains contributed to increased skepticism about future continental interventions. France gained the most diplomatically. Napoleon III hosted the peace conference, re-establishing France as the arbiter of European affairs for the first time since 1815. French military performance had generally exceeded British, restoring French military prestige. The war strengthened Napoleon III's domestic position and solidified French influence in European diplomacy. The Kingdom of Sardinia's participation yielded the desired reward. At the Paris Peace Conference, Prime Minister Cavour gained a platform to advocate for Italian unification, beginning the diplomatic process that would lead to the 1859 Franco-Sardinian alliance against Austria and ultimately to Italian unification under Sardinian leadership. Austria found itself in the worst strategic position. By threatening Russia without actually joining the war, gained immediate tactical advantages, Russian withdrawal from the Balkans, but made a permanent enemy of Russia without earning genuine gratitude from Britain and France. When Austria faced wars with France and Sardinia in 1859 and with Prussia in 1866, it would stand alone, unable to call on allies that no longer trusted it.
The Crimean War's casualty figures remain somewhat uncertain, but approximate totals illuminate the conflict's terrible human cost. Russia lost approximately 450,000 dead, the vast majority from disease rather than combat. French casualties totaled around 100,000 dead. Ottoman losses approached 45,000. Britain suffered approximately 22,000 dead. Sardinia lost 2,300 men. These casualty figures exceeded those of any European war since Napoleon's defeat in 1815. The disparity between combat deaths and disease deaths was stark. Perhaps 75% of casualties resulted from cholera, typhus, dysentery, and other diseases. This ratio reflected both the limited medical knowledge of the era and the unprecedented scale of armies operating far from their home bases in unfamiliar climates with inadequate sanitation. The Crimean War also affected civilian populations profoundly. Crimean Tatars, suspected by Russian authorities of Ottoman sympathies, faced increasing repression during and after the conflict. Thousands were deported to Central Asia. Others fled voluntarily to Ottoman territory, particularly to the Balkans and Anatolia.
Russian and Ukrainian settlers took their place, fundamentally changing Crimea's demographic character. By the late 19th century, Crimean Tatars had become a minority in their ancestral homeland, a transformation accelerated but not caused solely by the Crimean War. The war's impact extended beyond immediate casualties and demographic changes. The Crimean War influenced military thinking, medical practice, journalism, and international diplomacy in ways that shaped the remainder of the 19th century. Military historians debate the Crimean War's place in the evolution of warfare. Some call it the first modern war, pointing to the use of railways for logistics, telegraph communications, explosive artillery shells, rifled infantry weapons, ironclad warships, and the first systematic war photography. Others emphasize its traditional elements: cavalry charges, massed infantry assaults, siege warfare tactics that would have been recognizable to 18th century commanders, and religious rhetoric justifying conflict. Perhaps most accurate is to view the Crimean War as transitional, a conflict where traditional and modern elements coexisted uneasily, pointing toward but not fully embodying the industrial warfare that would characterize the late 19th and 20th centuries. Technologically, the war demonstrated new weapons potential. The Minié rifle, with its rifled barrel and expanding bullet, gave infantry unprecedented range and accuracy. At the Alma and Inkerman, British troops stopped Russian attacks at distances where Russian smoothbore muskets could not reply effectively. Within a decade, all European armies would adopt rifled weapons, fundamentally changing infantry tactics. The Russian use of explosive shells at Sinope and throughout the siege of Sevastopol demonstrated artillery's increasing lethality. Traditional solid shot could hole a ship's hull or knock down fortifications, but explosive shells set targets ablaze and created deadly shrapnel effects. Naval architecture began shifting toward iron and steel construction, culminating in fully ironclad warships within a few years. The railway's military use at Sevastopol, while limited compared to later conflicts, proved that railroads could sustain armies in the field at previously impossible scales. The telegraph allowed near-instant communication between commanders and their governments, though this also meant politicians could micromanage military operations from hundreds of miles away, a mixed blessing at best. Medical advances, particularly Pirogov's triage system and early use of anesthesia, saved lives and influenced military medical practice for decades. Florence Nightingale's hospital administration reforms, while controversial in their immediate impact, contributed to the professionalization of nursing and improved British military medical services for future conflicts. The Crimean War was also transitional in its war reporting and public engagement. William Howard Russell's dispatches to the Times of London and Roger Fenton's photographs brought the war to British civilians with unprecedented immediacy. Public opinion influenced government policy to a degree impossible in earlier eras. The scandal of British soldiers suffering from inadequate supplies helped topple a government. This foreshadowed the increasingly important role of public opinion and media coverage in 20th century warfare. Strategically, the Crimean War demonstrated both the power and limitations of maritime empires. Britain and France could project force globally, landing armies in Crimea, the Baltic, and the Pacific. Their naval power allowed them to blockade Russian coasts and cut supply lines. Yet naval power alone could not defeat a continental empire. Taking Sevastopol required grinding siege warfare. The war ended through negotiation, not decisive battlefield victory. The treaty's provisions for Black Sea neutralization proved temporary. Russia denounced these clauses in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, when European powers were too distracted to object. This demonstrated that treaties imposed by temporary coalitions held only as long as the power balance that created them persisted. The Crimean War failed to resolve the Eastern question that had sparked it.
The Ottoman Empire survived, gaining perhaps 15 years of relative security from Russian pressure, but Ottoman weakness continued. The empire's promised reforms largely failed to materialize. European powers continued to intervene in Ottoman affairs, citing the need to protect Christian minorities. Within 20 years of the Treaty of Paris, the Eastern question erupted again. In the 1870s, renewed Balkan crises leading to the Russo-Turkish War of 1878 to 1879. This time, Russia achieved dramatic victories, advancing to the outskirts of Constantinople and imposing the Treaty of San Stefano, which would have created a large Bulgarian state as a Russian client. Only European pressure forced revision of these terms at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. The pattern would repeat: Ottoman weakness, Balkan nationalism, great power intervention and crisis, followed by temporary resolution that solved nothing permanently. This cycle continued until World War I finally destroyed both the Ottoman and Russian empires, resolving the Eastern question through the elimination of both parties. The Crimean War also contributed to realignments in European diplomacy. The Austro-Russian breach proved lasting. Russian resentment of Austrian betrayal helped push Russia towards alliance with Prussia, later Germany, in the 1870s and 1880s. Austrian diplomatic isolation contributed to its defeats in 1859 and 1866. The victorious German Empire that emerged from the wars of German unification owed something to Austria's Crimean War diplomatic failures.
The Crimean War occupies a curious place in historical memory, simultaneously famous and obscure. Certain images and phrases remain iconic: Florence Nightingale with her lamp, the charge of the Light Brigade, the thin red line. Yet many people, even in the countries most directly involved, know little about the war's causes, course, or consequences. In Britain, the war is remembered primarily through the scandals and heroic failures: the Light Brigade's charge, the suffering of British soldiers from disease and cold, the incompetence of senior commanders contrasted with the courage of ordinary soldiers. Florence Nightingale became a national icon, though historians continued debating her actual impact. The war contributed to military reforms in the 1860s and 1870s, including abolition of the purchase system for officers' commissions and improvement of army medical services. In France, the war receives less attention than the wars of Italian and German unification that followed in the next 2 decades. Yet French military performance in the Crimea was generally superior to British, and the war strengthened Napoleon III's regime at a crucial period. French technological and tactical innovations, particularly in logistics and siege warfare, influenced military thinking throughout Europe. In Russia, the war represented a humiliating check to expansion, but not a catastrophic defeat. The loss of Sevastopol and Black Sea neutralization wounded national pride. The war exposed Russian military weaknesses that would lead to the great reforms of the 1860s, including emancipation of the serfs in 1861 and major military reorganization. Russian literature, particularly Tolstoy's Sevastopol sketches, preserved vivid accounts of the siege's horror and futility. For the Ottoman Empire, the war represented the last significant military success before the long decline of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The war's outcome guaranteed Ottoman survival for another generation, but also increased Ottoman dependence on European powers and their continued interference in Ottoman internal affairs. In Crimea itself, the war's legacy proved darkest. The conflict accelerated the displacement of Crimean Tatars and their replacement by Russian and Ukrainian settlers. This demographic transformation, which continued through the late 19th century and intensified catastrophically under Soviet rule in 1944, fundamentally altered Crimea's character. The question of Crimea's status, Russian, Ukrainian, or Tatar, remains contentious more than 150 years later, contributing to the Russian-Ukrainian conflicts of 2014 and beyond. The Crimean War thus remains relevant not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a conflict whose unresolved questions and geopolitical dynamics continue to shape international relations into the 21st century. The same region that saw British and French forces fight to contain Russian expansion in the 1850s saw renewed conflict in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. The echoes of the Eastern question reverberate still. In this sense, the Crimean War never truly ended. Its battles are over, its treaties signed, its soldiers long dead. But the fundamental questions it raised about power balances, ethnic nationalism, great power intervention, and regional autonomy remain as pressing today as when Prince Menshikov delivered his ultimatum in Constantinople in 1853. The last crusade proved not to be the last confrontation. The blood spilled on the heights of the Alma and in the ruins of Sevastopol purchased only a temporary peace. The Eastern question would outlive the empires that fought to answer it.